The bank statement was still open on my laptop when my mother called to ask if I'd RSVP'd to my cousin's bridal shower yet. My name is Maren. I'm 29, and 3 years ago I would have answered that call without even looking at the number first. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Dayton at 11 at night, the blue light of the screen the only thing on in the apartment, staring at a balance that read $312.47 where $41,000 should have been. I'd been saving that money since I was 22, every freelance check, every overtime shift at the agency, every birthday card with a folded 20 inside it, all of it going into the same account for 8 years, untouched, because it was going to be the down payment on a house I hadn't found yet. I answered my mother's call because some part of me, even staring at that number, still wanted to believe there was an explanation that didn't make my chest feel like it was caving in. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, bright as a kitchen window. "Did you get the invite for Brianna's shower?" I asked her, very calmly, if she knew anything about a transfer from my savings account. There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough. "We were going to tell you," she said. I want to back up, because the version of this story where I'm just a woman whose parents stole from her isn't the whole truth, and I promised myself I'd tell this honestly, even the parts that don't flatter me. I grew up in a house where I was the calm one. My older brother Dennis was the dramatic one, the one who got into things, debt, bad relationships, a DUI at 23 that my parents quietly paid a lawyer to make disappear. I was the one who got good grades without being asked, who called my mother every Sunday, who drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday night because my father said his blood pressure had been acting up and somebody should check on him. I liked being that person. I want to be honest about that too. There is a version of love that looks like sacrifice and feels, for a long time, indistinguishable from being needed, and I had built my whole identity on top of it without ever once examining the foundation. My parents, Carol and Richard, had always struggled with money in a way they never quite admitted to. My father had taken early retirement from the plant 11 years ago on a pension that turned out to be smaller than he'd promised my mother it would be, and my mother had a way of talking about money, vacations she'd always wanted to take, a kitchen renovation she'd been dreaming about for years, that made the wanting sound like a need. I'd helped before. $600 here, for a car repair. $1,000 once, when the furnace went out the same month as Dennis's bail. I always told myself it was a loan. I never once asked for the money back. I think I knew, somewhere underneath the part of me that needed to be the daughter who showed up, that asking would have broken something I wasn't ready to break. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, because the account was in my name only, opened the year I turned 22, with a password only I had, was that my mother had been added as a secondary authorized user almost 4 years ago. I'd done it after a minor surgery, in case something happened and someone needed access to pay a bill. I'd forgotten I'd ever done it. She hadn't. "We were going to tell you," she said again, when I didn't say anything. "Tell me what, Mom?" "It's not what you think." I want to stop here for a second, because I think some of you already know exactly what that sentence does to a person. "It's not what you think" is the sound of someone buying time inside a lie they haven't finished building yet. I'd heard her use that phrase before, about smaller things, things that turned out to be exactly what I thought, and some old, tired part of me recognized the shape of it even as the rest of me was still hoping I was wrong. She told me my father's truck had needed a transmission. That the insurance on the house had gone up. That there'd been some other things. She used the word "we" a lot, the way she always did when she meant herself, as though sharing the pronoun could distribute the responsibility evenly between two people who had not, in fact, made this decision together, because underneath all of it, I would learn later, was something much older and much less about transmissions. "How much?" I said. "Maren, don't make this into something it isn't." "How much, Mom?" The number she gave me was $8,000 short of the truth. I'd find that out in 3 weeks. That night, all she said was $33,000, and even that number made the room tilt slightly, the way it does right before you understand you're going to remember exactly where you were standing for the rest of your life. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with my phone face up on the pillow next to me, the way you do when you're waiting for a call you're afraid of and hoping for at the same time, and I thought about every Sunday dinner, every "you're so good to us," every Christmas where my mother had hugged me a half-second longer than usual and I'd felt, stupidly, proud of being the daughter who made things easier. By morning I had a plan, or what felt like one. I was going to call the bank. I was going to remove her as an authorized user. I was going to ask my father directly, because my father, for all his passivity, had never once lied to my face the way my mother could, smiling the whole time. What I didn't do, and this matters, because it's the first thing I got wrong, was tell anyone else. Not my best friend Priya, who I told almost everything. Not my brother. I sat with it alone for 4 days, turning it over like a stone I kept hoping would look different in better light, and in those 4 days, my mother had time to get ahead of me in a way I wouldn't fully understand until much later. That's the part of this story that took me the longest to admit out loud, that the version of myself who absorbed this kind of damage and just kept functioning, kept showing up to brunch, kept answering the phone, wasn't strength. It was a habit I'd built so long ago I'd mistaken it for my personality. I went to the bank on a Wednesday during my lunch break. The branch on Wilmington had the same beige carpet it had had since I opened the account at 22, and the same overhead lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. A man named Devin, mid-30s, kind eyes, pulled up my account and turned the monitor a few degrees so I could see it too. "You want to remove the secondary user," he confirmed. "Yes." He typed for a moment, then frowned slightly at the screen, not alarmed, just the small pause of someone double-checking something. "I want to flag something for you before we do that," he said. There were 2 transfers from this account in the last 6 weeks. One for $18,000, one for $15,500. Both to the same external account. $33,500. $500 more than what my mother had told me, which felt, in that moment, like such a small lie compared to the larger one that I almost laughed. "That's the number she gave me," I said, mostly to myself. "You said she." Devin looked at me carefully. "Ma'am, I have to ask, was this transfer authorized by you?" I said no. And saying it out loud, to a stranger, in a bank with beige carpet, was the first time the whole thing became real instead of just devastating. He explained my options. I could file a dispute, but disputes on authorized user transfers were complicated, especially when the funds had already been moved out and the authorized user was a blood relative who could plausibly claim the access had been a gift or an understanding. I could pursue it legally. I could simply close the account and walk away from trying to recover it. He wasn't unkind about any of it. He was just honest, in the practiced, gentle way of someone who had clearly delivered this kind of news before. "What would you do," I asked him, "if it was your mother?" He didn't answer that. He just slid a pamphlet across the counter about fraud protection and told me to take some time before I decided anything. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive back to work. I remember the specific sound the engine made when I finally turned the key, how ordinary it was, how the radio came on mid-song like nothing in the world had changed, and how strange it felt that the world hadn't noticed. That night I called Priya. I'd been holding it in for 5 days by then, and the moment she picked up, something in me just broke open. I told her everything. The transfer, the bank, the 18 and the 15,500, my mother's voice saying it's not what you think. There was a pause on Priya's end. Different from my mother's pause. Longer. "Maren," she said slowly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not hate me. I'm going to stop here, because this is the part where the story stops being only about my mother." Priya and I had been friends since college, the kind of friendship where you've seen each other through bad breakups and worse haircuts, where she'd been the one to drive 4 hours to help me move out of an apartment with a man who turned out not to deserve the effort. I trusted her the way you trust people you've stopped examining, the way you trust a piece of furniture to hold your weight because it always has. "Your mom called me," Priya said. "About 2 months ago." I sat very still. Something in my chest had gone tight and small, the kind of tightness I'd later recognize as a pattern, a thing my body did right before it learned something it couldn't take back. "She said your dad's pension had taken a hit," Priya went on. "Some kind of restructuring at his old company," she said. She said they were embarrassed to ask you directly because you'd already done so much. She asked if I thought you'd be upset if she borrowed a little, temporarily, and paid it back before you noticed. And you said yes. I said I didn't know, Maren. I told her I thought she should ask you herself. But you didn't tell me she asked. The silence on the line went on long enough that I could hear her breathing change. I didn't want to get in the middle of it, she finally said. I thought it wasn't my place. I thought if she told you herself, like she said she would, it would all just be a normal family thing, and if I said something first, I'd be the one who ruined it. I want to be honest about something here, because this story isn't useful to anyone if I pretend I handled this part perfectly. I yelled at her. Not for long, not viciously, but in a way that surprised both of us. Sharp, fast words about loyalty and what kind of friend sits on something like that for 2 months. Some of what I said was true. Some of it was the kind of thing you say when you've just found out the ground under you was never as solid as you thought, and you need somewhere to put the falling feeling before it swallows you. She didn't defend herself much. She just kept saying she was sorry, and somewhere underneath my anger I understood that her silence hadn't been malice. It had been the same kind of conflict avoidance I'd spent my whole life practicing myself, just turned, this time, against me instead of for me. That didn't make it hurt less. It just made it a different kind of familiar. If you've ever found out that someone close to you knew something that would have changed everything, and chose comfort over honesty, you know exactly what that phone call felt like. The particular loneliness of realizing the people closest to you had each, in their own way, decided your peace of mind was less important than their own discomfort. I hung up before either of us said anything that couldn't be walked back. I didn't talk to Priya again for 19 days. I went back to work the next morning like nothing had happened, because that was what I knew how to do. I let a client call about a rebrand for a regional grocery chain. I answered emails. I smiled at my coworker Janelle's joke about the office coffee machine, and the whole time there was a low hum underneath everything, like a refrigerator running in another room, the kind of sound you stop noticing until someone points it out and then you can't hear anything else. My mother called twice that week. I didn't answer either time. The third time, she texted, "We need to talk about this like adults. I'd had to use that money for an emergency. I'll pay you back, you know I will. Please don't punish your father for this, he had nothing to do with it." That last sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she'd said. He had nothing to do with it. As if absolving him in advance was more urgent to her than acknowledging what she'd actually done to me. I started sleeping badly. Not dramatically, I wasn't lying awake sobbing, but I'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached, and I'd lie there running numbers, trying to remember exactly how much I'd put into that account, exactly how many years of careful nothing, no vacations, a 10-year-old car I kept driving past the point of embarrassment, lunches packed instead of bought, had gone into a balance that no longer existed. I started checking my phone for her calls with a feeling in my stomach I didn't have a name for yet, something between dread and a strange, stubborn hope that this time she'd say something that made it make sense. It never did. About 2 weeks after the bank visit, I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday, the way I always had, because some old reflex in me still believed that face-to-face, in the kitchen where I'd grown up, this could somehow be fixed. My father was in the garage when I arrived, doing something to the lawnmower that didn't need doing, the way he always retreated to small mechanical tasks whenever the house got too loud with feeling. "Your mother's inside," he said, not looking up. "She's been a wreck about this, Maren." "She's been a wreck," I repeated. He finally looked at me, and for a second, just a second, something passed over his face that looked almost like guilt. Then it was gone, replaced by the same vague, retreating expression he always wore when conflict came near him. "It's complicated," he said. "There's more to it than just the money." I didn't understand what he meant by that. Not then. I filed it away, the way you file away a detail that doesn't fit yet, certain you'll need it later and not knowing why. My mother was at the kitchen table when I walked in, a cup of tea in front of her that she wasn't drinking, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She looked, for a moment, exactly like she had at every kitchen table of my childhood, soft-faced, a little tired, completely familiar, and something in me wanted so badly to fold into that familiarity instead of standing in it like a stranger. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "Good," she said. "Because I don't think you understand how hard this has been on us. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever sat across from the person who hurt you and watched them make their own guilt the centerpiece of the conversation, you already know what came next." She talked for almost 20 minutes. About my father's pension. About a medical bill from 2 years ago she'd never mentioned. About how she'd meant to tell me sooner but kept losing her nerve, how every time she tried, I seemed so busy, so stressed with work, and she didn't want to add to it. She used the word borrow 4 times. She never once used the word took, and she never once asked how I was doing with any of it, not how I'd felt finding out, not what it had cost me beyond the dollar amount, not whether I was sleeping, not whether I was okay. That was the moment something in me went quiet in a different way than before. Not calm. Just done listening for an apology that wasn't coming. "I want it back," I said. "All of it. With a plan. In writing." My mother's face did something complicated, surprise, then something colder underneath it, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "You're going to make us sign something," she said, "like we're strangers. You took $33,500 out of my account without asking me," I said. "We are not the kind of family where I can just trust that this gets handled. Don't be dramatic, Maren." I left without finishing my tea. I didn't slam the door. I just left, and the quiet of my own car on the drive home felt louder than any argument we could have had. I want to pause here, because something happened in the weeks that followed that I didn't understand until much later, and I think it's important to say it plainly. My mother started behaving strangely in ways that had nothing to do with the money on the surface. She called my Aunt Diane 3 times in 1 week, which she never did. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she and my father had been looking into some things, with a lawyer, financial planning, she said, though her voice did something small and tight on the word lawyer that I noticed but didn't understand. She started arriving 15 minutes early to family events, which was new, and leaving early too, as though she needed to control the exact shape and duration of every interaction now instead of letting it unfold the way it always had. At the time I read all of it as guilt. Simple, ordinary guilt, the kind that makes a person fidgety and overly polite. I didn't yet know there was a second layer underneath the first one, that the $33,500 wasn't the medical bill or the pension shortfall she claimed it was, and that the version of events I'd been given was, like so much else, only partially true. Looking back now, I think that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding, not how much, but why now? Why, after 8 years of that account sitting untouched, had she needed it suddenly, urgently, twice in 6 weeks, without ever once asking me to my face? I didn't ask it then. I was too busy being hurt to be curious, and I think some part of me already sensed that the answer would cost more than I was ready to pay. I went back to work and tried to put it in a box. I'm good at that, or I was, then. I threw myself into the grocery chain rebrand, stayed late 3 nights that week color-correcting packaging mock-ups that didn't need me there past 6, because the office was quiet and predictable in a way nothing else in my life currently was. Janelle asked me twice if I was okay. I said I was fine both times, the way you do when fine has become a word you use instead of a true sentence. It was Priya who finally broke through, 19 days after I'd hung up on her. She showed up at my apartment on a Thursday night with a bag of takeout and didn't say anything when I opened the door except, "I'm not leaving until you eat something." We sat on my couch and didn't talk about the call for the first 20 minutes, and somewhere in that easy, ordinary silence, her stealing food off my plate the way she always had, the TV playing something neither of us was watching, I felt the anger in me loosen, not because it had stopped being justified, but because I was tired of carrying it alone on top of everything else. "I should have told you," she said eventually. "I keep thinking about all the ways I should have told you." "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because your mom has always been, you know how she is. She makes you feel like saying no to her is a betrayal." I told myself I was protecting the family. I think really I just didn't want to be the one who broke something. I understood that more than I wanted to. It was, after all, exactly the kind of thinking I'd built my entire relationship with my parents on top of. "I need you to actually be honest with me from now on," I said. "Even when it's about my family. Especially then." "I will," she said. "I promise." I believed her. I think, looking back, that was the right thing to do, not because the broken trust magically repaired itself in one conversation over cold pad thai, but because I'd learned something that week about the difference between people who hurt you on purpose and people who hurt you by accident, by omission, by the same cowardice you recognize because you've practiced it yourself. Priya and I were going to be okay. My mother was a different question entirely, and some quiet, frightened part of me had already started to suspect I knew the answer. That was the first time I truly started to doubt, not just my mother's honesty about the money, but the whole architecture of what I'd believed our relationship was. If she could lie about this, smoothly, for weeks, while asking my best friend to lie too, what else had I never thought to question? I started keeping a folder. Bank statements, the text messages where she'd admitted to borrowing, screenshots of her calls to me that I'd let go to voicemail along with the transcripts, dated and organized in a way that felt, at the time, like something I was doing for protection. I didn't fully admit to myself yet what I was actually doing, which was building a case. I told myself I just wanted to keep things straight in my head. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever found yourself quietly gathering proof of something you're not ready to say out loud yet, you know exactly what those nights at my kitchen table felt like, the laptop light too bright in an otherwise dark apartment, sorting through evidence of a betrayal I still half hoped I'd misunderstood. 3 weeks after the bank visit, I finally called my Aunt Diane myself, my mother's younger sister, the one person in the family who had always told me the truth even when it cost her something. I asked her, carefully, if she knew anything about why my mother had needed money so urgently, twice, in such a short window. There was a long pause on the line. The kind that tells you everything before the words arrive. "Maren," she said slowly, "I think you need to ask your mother about Gary." I didn't know who Gary was. I'd never heard the name before in my life. "Don't tell her I said anything," Diane added quickly. "Please. I shouldn't even be saying this much. But I think there's more going on than what she's told you, and I don't think it's my place to be the one who tells you the rest of it." I sat with that name for 2 days before I did anything with it. I didn't tell my mother I knew it existed. I didn't confront anyone. I just held it, the way the bank teller's words had hung in the air weeks before, a piece of evidence I wasn't ready to use yet, something I needed to understand fully before I let anyone know I had it. What I did instead, quietly, methodically, in the evenings after work, was look. I found, eventually, a name attached to a small construction business 2 towns over, a man named Gary Pruitt, 59, listed as the sole proprietor of a company that had filed for a minor lien dispute the previous year. I found, through a property records search I almost felt ashamed of running, that a payment of exactly $15,500 had gone out from an account linked to my mother's name to a business account belonging to Gary Pruitt Construction, 3 days after the second transfer left mine. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not Priya. Not my father. I put the printout in the folder, on top of everything else, and I closed my laptop, and I sat in the dark for a long time, turning over a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. What does a 58-year-old woman need $15,000 to give to a man named Gary for, in cash, quietly, twice, once she'd already taken $18,000 for something else entirely? I want to be honest about something here too, because this story doesn't mean anything if I only tell the parts where I look smart or composed. I came close to confronting her with it that same week, calling her up, reading the name off the screen, demanding she explain it on the spot, in the white heat of finding it. I had the phone in my hand. I'd even dialed the first 3 digits. And then I stopped, because some instinct I couldn't fully name told me that if I used it too soon, in anger, without understanding what it actually meant, she would find a way to make it disappear, the same way the money already had. So I put the phone down. I put the printout back in the folder exactly where I'd found it. And I waited. If you've ever been the person everyone counts on but no one accounts for, stay with me. Because what I found out about Gary changed everything I thought I understood about my own family, and not in the way you might expect. I want to step outside the story for a moment, because there's something I have to tell you about my mother that she never told me directly, and that I only pieced together over the following month from fragments. A comment from Aunt Diane here, a half-finished sentence from my father there, an old photograph I found tucked into a recipe box I was helping clean out for Brianna's shower. My mother grew up the older of two daughters in a house where her own mother had left when she was 11, walked out one September morning and never came back, leaving my grandfather to raise two girls on a factory salary that never quite stretched far enough. My mother had spent her whole childhood being the one who held things together, the one who learned to cook because someone had to, the one who signed permission slips with a forged version of her mother's name because asking her father to do it made him cry. She married my father at 20, young, in a hurry, because, she told my aunt once, decades ago, she wanted, more than anything, to never again be in a house where the money simply ran out and nobody told you why. That fear never left her. It just got quieter, more buried, dressed up over the years as competence, as planning, as the kind of careful, controlling presence she became in every room she entered. I think, somewhere underneath the woman who'd lied to me for weeks, there was still an 11-year-old girl standing in a kitchen that had gone suddenly, inexplicably empty, terrified of it happening again. That doesn't excuse what she did. I want to be very clear about that, because I spent a long time afterward almost talking myself out of my own anger using exactly this kind of understanding, and I've since learned that understanding someone's wound is not the same as accepting what they did with it. But it explains something. It explains why control mattered more to her than honesty. It explains why, when her own carefully built sense of stability felt threatened, by a debt I'd later learned she'd quietly carried for years, tied to a man named Gary who was not, as I'd briefly and uneasily wondered, anything more complicated than an old friend from her hometown who'd fallen on hard times and to whom she felt an obligation she'd never once mentioned to anyone in our family. She reached for the one resource she knew she could access without anyone stopping her in time. She told me, much later, what was actually going through her mind in the weeks before she took the money. This is what she said, as close as I can remember it, though I won't pretend I've reconstructed every word exactly. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself she had plenty, she was young, she had time to build it back, and Gary didn't have time at all. He was going to lose the business, lose the house his kids grew up in, after everything our families had been through together when we were young, after everything he did for our family the year your grandfather got sick and I didn't know who else to call. I told myself I'd pay it back before she even noticed, and for a while I almost believed that was a plan and not just a story I needed to survive the asking. I didn't let myself think about what it would cost you to find out, because if I let myself think about that, I wouldn't have been able to do it, and I needed to do it. I've spent my whole life being the person who makes sure nobody in this family goes without, and I could not be the reason somebody I loved lost everything, not again, not after watching it happen once already and being too small to stop it. I'm not going to pretend that explanation made the 11 o'clock nights at my kitchen table disappear. It didn't undo the $33,500, or the lie that had run alongside it for weeks, or the 2 months she'd spent quietly enlisting my own best friend in keeping it from me. But I understood, hearing it, that I had not been raised by a simple villain. I had been raised by a frightened woman who had decided, somewhere a long time before I was born, that control was the only form of safety she could trust, and who had finally let that fear make a choice for her that she could not take back. I didn't know any of this yet. Not fully, on the night I sat in my dark apartment with the printout of Gary Pruitt's construction company. All I knew then was a name and a number and a 58-year-old mother who had not told me the truth even once she'd been caught. I started losing weight that I hadn't meant to lose. I noticed it the way you notice these things, a pair of jeans that used to fit snug now gapped slightly at the waist, a plate of dinner I'd push around without finishing, the specific tightness in my chest every time my phone buzzed with my mother's name on the screen, a fast, cold pulse of dread before I even read the message. I started waking at 3 again, my heart going too fast for no reason I could point to, lying in the dark listening to my own pulse until it slowed enough to let me fall back asleep. I told Priya about Gary. I told her everything this time, the whole folder, the property records, the construction company, the question I still hadn't asked out loud. She didn't tell me to confront my mother right away. She didn't tell me to let it go either. She just listened, the way a person listens when they've decided, this time, to actually show up. "What do you want to happen?" she asked me, near the end of that conversation, and it was such a simple question that it stopped me cold, because I realized I hadn't actually let myself answer it yet. I'd been so focused on the money, on the lie, on the slow unraveling of who I'd thought my mother was, that I hadn't once asked myself what I actually wanted from this: repayment, an apology, distance, or something else entirely that I didn't yet have a word for. I don't know, I told her honestly. I think I want her to admit what she did. Really admit it. Not the version where it's complicated and everyone's a little bit at fault. And if she doesn't? I didn't answer that one. I didn't have an answer yet. But somewhere underneath the not knowing, something had already started to shift, a quiet, growing certainty that whatever happened next, I was done being the daughter who absorbed things silently and called it love. My cousin Brianna's bridal shower was scheduled for the second Saturday of the following month, at my Aunt Diane's house, the same house where I'd spent half my childhood birthdays. I almost didn't go. I sat with the invitation for 3 days, the cardstock edge soft from how many times I'd picked it up and put it down, before I decided I would, not for Brianna, exactly, though I loved her, but because some part of me understood that if I avoided every room my mother might be in, I'd be giving her exactly the kind of quiet, manageable distance she could explain away to the rest of the family as me being dramatic, or going through something. I wanted to be in the room. I wanted her to have to look at me. I brought the folder. I didn't plan to use it that day. I told myself I was just bringing it because I didn't trust leaving it anywhere my mother might have access to, which by then had become its own small, sad kind of vigilance. I left it in my car, zipped into my bag in the trunk, and told myself it would stay there. The shower itself was exactly what you'd expect: pastel napkins, a game involving toilet paper wrapped as wedding dresses, my mother working the room in the particular bright, hostessy way she always did at family events, refilling drinks before anyone asked, complimenting Brianna's mother's centerpieces loud enough for the whole room to hear. I watched her do it and felt something cold and strange settle in my stomach, the specific vertigo of watching someone perform warmth, now, isn't load-bearing. It was my Aunt Diane, of all people, who set the day on its actual course, not on purpose, I don't think, though I've wondered since how much she knew and chose not to say outright. She was helping clear plates in the kitchen, and she said, conversationally, not quite to me, not quite to the room, "Your mother tells me Gary's doing better since she helped him out. That whole thing with the house, I'm glad it worked out." I felt the air in the kitchen change before anyone said another word. My mother's face, across the counter, did something fast and small, a flicker, gone almost before it registered, the look of someone who has just watched a door they thought was locked swing open in front of guests. "Diane," she said, quiet, almost a warning. "What?" Diane looked between us, confused, and I understood in that moment that she genuinely hadn't realized what she'd just said, or to whom, or what it would do. I didn't say anything right away. I want you to understand that I didn't explode in that kitchen, didn't make a scene in front of Brianna's future mother-in-law and a dozen women I barely knew. I just looked at my mother, and she looked back at me, and something passed between us that didn't need words yet, both of us understanding, in that frozen half-second, that the version of the story she'd told me weeks ago, the medical bill, the pension shortfall, the vague, sympathetic complications, had just come apart in front of witnesses. I excused myself. I walked out to my car, unzipped my bag, and took out the folder, and by the time I walked back into Diane's living room, where most of the guests had drifted after the kitchen, my hands weren't quite steady, but I kept walking anyway. I asked my mother if we could talk privately. She suggested the back porch. I said no, and I want to be honest, this was not a calculated choice, it was instinct, fast and certain in a way few of my decisions had been over the past month. I said whatever we needed to say, we could say in front of the family, because I was tired of this only ever happening behind closed doors where it was easy to control. That's where part 5 of this story really begins. And I won't pretend, looking back, that I walked into that living room as calm as I'd planned to be. My mother believed, walking into that confrontation, that she still had the room. She'd had weeks to prepare for the possibility that this conversation would eventually happen, and she'd clearly decided, somewhere along the way, that if it ever did, it would happen on her terms: soft lighting, the right audience, the narrative already half built in her favor. She thought she'd be explaining a complicated, sympathetic situation to a daughter who loved her too much to make it ugly in front of family. She was not expecting me to be holding a folder. She was not expecting Diane's slip in the kitchen to have already cracked the foundation she'd built her explanation on. I set the folder down on Aunt Diane's coffee table, in front of maybe 9 people: Diane, Brianna and her fiancé's mother, 2 cousins, my father standing near the doorway like he was trying to decide whether he was allowed to leave. I didn't open it dramatically. I just set it down, and said, "I want to talk about the $33,500 you took out of my savings account, and about Gary Pruitt." The room went very quiet. "This isn't the time, Maren," my mother said, glancing around at the gathered faces, her voice pitched low and reasonable, the voice she used when she wanted to make herself sound like the only adult in the room. "You took my entire savings," I said, and I felt something in my own chest give way as I said it. Not collapse. Exactly, more like a dam finally letting water through after holding it back too long. "You lied to me about why. You asked my best friend to lie to me too. And when I found out, you sat across from me at your own kitchen table and made it about how hard this has been on you." "That's not fair," my mother said, and her face had gone tight now, color rising in her cheeks. "You don't know everything that's going on." "Then tell me. Tell everyone. Tell them about Gary." I hadn't planned to say his name out loud in front of the whole room. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't strategy. It was the unexpected anger finding its own way out faster than I could direct it, and the moment I said it, I watched something close in my mother's face, a door slamming shut behind her eyes. "You have no right," she said, "to bring up something that's none of these people's business, in someone else's home, at someone else's party. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me?" "Humiliating for you," I repeated, and I could hear my own voice shaking now, not with fear but with something closer to disbelief. "You stole from me. 4 weeks. And you're worried about being humiliated." "I didn't steal from you," she snapped, and here it came, the thing I'd been braced for without quite knowing it, reaction 3, though I had no name for it yet, only the unmistakable, sickening sensation of watching the ground shift under my own feet. "You want to talk about what's fair? Let's talk about every time I bailed your brother out and never once asked you to thank me for understanding why I had to. Let's talk about how you've always made yourself the martyr in this family, Maren, the good one, the responsible one. You loved being needed, don't pretend you didn't. You think I don't know that half of why you keep showing up here every Sunday is because being needed is the only way you know how to feel important? I didn't take anything from you that you weren't already giving away for free, every single week, for years." The room had gone completely silent. I felt the words land somewhere I hadn't expected them to, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they were true enough, in exactly the wrong proportion, to make me doubt, for one terrible second, whether I had any right to be standing there at all. "That's not the same thing," I said, but my voice had lost some of its certainty, and I hated that it had. "Isn't it?" my mother said. "You've spent your whole life deciding what you give this family and how much, and the one time I needed something without asking your permission first, suddenly I'm a criminal. You don't get to play the victim every time someone in this family needs you and doesn't say please exactly the way you wanted." I felt myself, for one long, terrible moment, starting to apologize, the old reflex rising up out of somewhere deep and well-worn, the part of me that had spent 29 years smoothing things over before they could fully become a problem. I actually opened my mouth to say I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that, before I caught the shape of what I was about to do and stopped myself, mid-breath, the way you catch your own foot before it lands wrong on a stair. It was my father who broke the silence, not in the way I expected. "Carol," he said, quietly, from the doorway, "tell her the rest of it." My mother turned on him with a look I'd never seen her give him before, not anger, exactly, something closer to betrayal, as though he'd just handed something private over to an enemy. "Richard. She deserves to know it wasn't just Gary's house," he said, and his voice, usually so quiet it barely registered in a room, carried clearly to every corner of it. "Tell her about the loan you co-signed for him 11 years ago that he never paid back. Tell her you've been covering pieces of that debt out of our own savings for years before you ever touched hers, and that when our savings ran out, you needed somewhere else to go and you didn't want to tell me how bad it had actually gotten, because you didn't want me to know you'd been managing it alone, badly, for over a decade." I felt the floor of the story shift again, a third time in one afternoon, and I understood, watching my father's face, tired, finally honest in a way I'd never seen from him, that I had walked into a much older story than the one I thought I was confronting. My mother didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She stood very still for a moment, looking between my father and me, and something in her seemed to deflate slightly, not into softness, but into a kind of cornered stillness I recognized, somewhere underneath my own anger, as fear. "I did what I thought I had to do," she said finally, quieter now, the performance gone out of her voice. "I've spent my whole life making sure this family didn't fall apart the way mine did. I'm not going to apologize for that, even if I went about it wrong." It was Aunt Diane, of all people, who I'd later learn knew about Gary's debt for years and had simply never said anything, choosing, like so many people in this story, silence over honesty, who finally spoke into the stillness that followed. "Carol," she said softly, "she's not asking you to apologize for loving him. She's asking you to apologize for lying to your own daughter." My mother didn't answer that. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. I picked up the folder. I didn't throw it, didn't make any further speech. I said one thing, quietly, to my mother, in front of everyone: "I want everything documented and repaid, on a schedule, in writing, through the bank, not through a conversation in someone's living room. And until that happens, I'm not coming to Sunday dinners." Then I left. My father followed me out to my car, which I hadn't expected, and stood there for a moment in the cold not saying anything, before he finally said, "I should have told you years ago how bad it had gotten. I let her carry it alone because it was easier than dealing with it myself. That's on me too." It wasn't an apology, exactly. But it was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, and I let myself accept it as enough, for that day, because I didn't have anything left to give the conversation beyond that. It took 4 months for my mother to pay back the first portion of what she owed me, $11,000, transferred in a single payment, with no note attached, no acknowledgement beyond the bank confirmation that landed in my email on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a meeting about Q3 packaging deadlines. I remember reading the notification on my phone under the conference table and feeling almost nothing, not relief, not vindication, just a flat, tired recognition that the number on the screen would never undo the 4 sleepless months it had taken to get there. The rest came slower, in smaller pieces, over the better part of a year. We set up the repayment the way I'd asked, through the bank, documented, no more conversations that could later be reframed as misunderstandings. My mother never gave me the kind of apology I used to think I needed, the one where she'd finally say, plainly, "I was wrong and I hurt you and I'm sorry," without immediately following it with an explanation that made it someone else's fault. What I got instead, slowly, over months of careful, limited contact, was something smaller and more honest in its own way. A woman who stopped performing warmth at me and started, occasionally, in unguarded moments, telling me true things about her own life. About the 11-year-old girl in the empty kitchen. About Gary, who she'd grown up next door to, whose mother had been the only adult who fed her some weeks when her own house had nothing. About my father, who she'd married, she admitted once, almost in passing, partly because she was so afraid of ending up like her own mother that she'd needed proof, fast, that someone could be made to stay. I didn't move back into the old rhythm of Sunday dinners. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's the part of this story people most want to hear resolved neatly, and it didn't resolve that way. I see my parents now maybe once a month, on terms I set, in places I choose, for lengths of time that work for me instead of for them. My father and I talk more than we used to, small, ordinary conversations about nothing, the kind I'd always wanted and never quite gotten when I was the daughter trying to fix everyone's blood pressure and bail money. My mother and I are something more careful than we used to be, something neither of us has a clean word for yet. I rebuilt the savings account from almost nothing. It took 2 years of doing exactly what I'd done the first time, careful, unglamorous, unremarkable saving, except this time I closed the authorization that had let anyone else into it, and I told almost no one the balance, not because I don't trust the people in my life now, but because some things I've decided are simply mine, fully, without anyone else's hand in them. I bought a small house 11 months ago, on my own, with my own name on every piece of paper, in a neighborhood close enough to Priya's that we still have dinner most weeks, far enough from my parents' house that the drive feels, finally, like a choice instead of an obligation. I think about that 11 o'clock night at my kitchen table sometimes, the blue light of the laptop, the number that wasn't supposed to be there, the version of myself who still believed every problem in my family was hers to fix if she just stayed calm enough, generous enough, good enough. I don't recognize that version of myself completely anymore, and I don't say that with pride, exactly. I say it the way you describe an old photograph of someone you used to be, with tenderness, and a little grief, and the quiet understanding that she did the best she knew how with what she had. I realized, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that I hadn't been protecting my family all those years so much as I'd been protecting an idea of myself, the daughter who held everything together, the one who never needed anything back. I'd built my whole sense of worth on being useful, on being the person nobody had to worry about, and it took watching that same usefulness get quietly emptied out of a bank account for me to understand how little it had ever actually protected me in return. That detail my aunt let slip in the kitchen, about Gary, about the help my mother had given him, seemed small at the time, almost an afterthought in someone else's conversation. It wasn't small. It was the loose thread that, once pulled, unraveled an entire decade of decisions my mother had made alone, in silence, rather than risk anyone seeing how frightened she actually was of losing what little stability she'd built. I understand now that her secrecy wasn't really about me at all. It was about a story she'd been telling herself since she was 11 years old, about what happens to women who let people see the cracks before they've finished pretending everything is fine. I used to call it a coincidence, the way the truth finally came out in someone else's living room instead of mine. I wouldn't call it that anymore. I think some truths only surface in rooms crowded enough that the person holding them can no longer control who's listening, and some part of me, without fully admitting it to myself, chose that bridal shower because some quieter, more strategic version of me already understood that. What this story leaves me with isn't really about the money, even though the money is what started it. It's about the difference between being loved and being needed, and how long it can take a person to understand they've spent years mistaking one for the other. My mother needed me to be the daughter who never asked for anything, because that daughter never made her confront what she'd built her own sense of safety on top of. I needed to be that daughter because it was the only role in our family I'd ever been certain I was good at. We were both, in our own ways, protecting something that was never actually safe to begin with. The real turning point wasn't the bank statement, and it wasn't even the living room. It was the quiet decision, weeks later, sitting alone in my apartment with a folder full of evidence I'd finally stopped being afraid to use, to ask for something in writing instead of accepting another conversation built on trust one no longer had reason to extend. That's where the daughter who held everything together finally stopped being the only version of me available in that family. I didn't become someone harder. I became someone with a boundary, which is a different thing entirely, and it took me 29 years to learn the difference. If you've ever realized that the people who taught you what love looks like were also the people who taught you what to ignore, I think you already understand what I mean when I say healing isn't about stopping loving them. It's about finally loving yourself enough to stop disappearing in order to do it. I think about my mother sometimes, now, not as the villain of this story and not as a woman I've fully forgiven, but as someone shaped by a fear so old it predates me entirely, doing damage with it the way frightened people sometimes do, without ever quite meaning to. I don't know if she'll ever say the words I once thought I needed to hear from her. I've stopped waiting for them. The repayment came in installments, slow and imperfect, the way most real reckonings do, not as one clean apology, but as 1,000 small, ordinary Tuesdays in which she chose, finally, to be honest instead of comfortable. What hurt the most, in the end, wasn't even the money. It was being called ungrateful by the person who taught me what gratitude was supposed to look like, as if the years I'd spent showing up, calling every Sunday, smoothing every rough edge of that family, had simply been my job all along, and asking for honesty in return was somehow an overreach. I carry that sentence with me still, some nights. But I carry it differently now. Not as proof that I owe anyone an apology for finally protecting myself. As proof of exactly how far I've come from the daughter who would have apologized first. If something in this story sounds familiar, a parent, a friend, a person you trusted who let you down in a way that took you months to even name, I'd love to hear it. Drop one word in the comments, the name, or just the moment, when you finally saw the red flag you'd been looking past for years. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It wasn't an easy story to tell, and I'm grateful you stayed for all of it.